Hello and welcome to Labor Jump Podcast, where we discuss the working class history of Philadelphia and the surrounding world. My name is Sam James, and to my right here, but on to everybody's left is...
I'm Gabe Christy. I'm the other half of this podcast. And yeah, we'll be talking about some stuff today.
Well, Gabe, what are we talking about today?
So today, we're going to be looking specifically at Philly's radical Jewish history from about the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century.
Okay.
And I've created a presentation called Etwas Radikal geschehen do. Something radical happened here. But before we get into all of this, we have to lay some groundwork with leftist Jewish math. So I'm sure any of the Jews in the audience will know that 2 Jews is 3 opinions, or 3-0. So we can mathematically show this with J sub 1 and times J sub 2 will give you inevitably 3-0. It's also well known on the left that 2 leftists will give you 3 opinions. So L sub 1 times L sub 2 is 3-0. But what happens when you have 2 Jewish leftists? Now, initially, you'd assume that it would just be 3-0. But really, you have to think about it as J sub 1 times L sub 1 times J sub 2 times L sub 2.
Have we lost anybody yet? We're still here, right? Okay.
So really, it's 3 opinions times 3 opinions, which is 9 opinions. So just bear this in mind as we go through, and absolutely no one we're going to talk about ever agreeing with anyone else. And to demonstrate that, we have a wide collection here of various people, various Jews on the left, not necessarily on the Jewish left. In the top left, we have Samuel Gompers, one of the founding members and longtime president of the American Federation of Labor. David Dubinsky, a former Bundist, who then went on to lead the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Ben Gold, another Jewish communist who went on to lead the International Fur and Leather Workers Union. Lower right, we have Clara Lemlech, who's a shirtwaist maker, went on to be one of the leaders of the uprising of the 20,000. David Edelstadt is a Jewish anarchist, one of the founders of the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which is we'll get into that newspaper in a little bit. And then, of course, the lovely Emma Goldman. Is,
the Queen.
The Queen. The Queen of Anarchy.
There will be a test afterwards.
Yes, I hope everyone remembered that. But before we get into Philadelphia specifically, we have to talk about how Jews got over here, because surprisingly, we didn't originate in the Napahoking.
What?
So...
I thought it was a Yiddish word.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you ask Mel Brooks. But early Jewish immigration to Philly was mostly, initially it was wealthy Sephardic Jews, so Jews from of Spanish origin, and they basically came over from the 1600s onward, or from 1680s. Mm-hmm. They were generally wealthy, tied to the merchant trades, and then later on in the beginning of the 18th century, you had some German Jews like the Gratz family. This is Rebecca Gratz coming over, but still very wealthy and very tied to the early American bourgeoisie, or the early American owning class. Then there's this guy over in Russia named Tsar Alexander II. Yeah, he's bad, but he died. And then, unfortunately, we got blamed for his death. And there were a whole bunch of pogroms starting in the 1880s. And so people fled from the pogroms. The established Jewish community in the U.S. Really tried to assimilate and kind of pacify the more radical working class Jews that were coming over at the end of the 19th century. So there was always throughout all of this, even as we're talking about the Jewish left, there's always been an internal Jewish class war going on, which we will get into a little bit.
Just no more math, please.
No.
Just no more math.
There are numbers.
That's all right.
But
we can do numbers.
Yeah. So by between 1885 and 1899, about 36,000 Jews immigrated to Philadelphia. By 1907, there was a population of about 150,000. They were mostly living in South Philly and Kensington. Kensington was the major garment district in Philly. South Philly did also have some garment shops, but that was also where a lot of the Jewish dock workers were living, because that was the dock working community. But now we're going to get into something actually fun.
Oh no.
Yeah. So the earliest form of the Jewish left that really showed up in Philly were some anarchist groups that first started in, I think, the 1880s.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. The one really good history we have of it is the memoirs of Chaim Lieb Weinberg, who basically just wrote down his memoirs without dates, so it's really hard to get a sense of when everything is happening. So you start out with the Knights of Liberty in the 1880s, which was kind of half inspired by the Knights of Labor, but was also a more specifically anarchist reading group. Mm-hmm. And which also today, I would never trust anyone in an organization today called the Knights of Liberty, but in the 1880s...
Anything with liberty.
Yeah. In the 1880s, it was part of the libertarian anarchist movement. And basically it started with a reading group of a bunch of Jewish workers who would meet in each other's houses and just talk and read anarchist text.
Can we peel back the curtain a little bit?
Yeah.
With the word liberty? Do you remember when we were starting with names of this podcast before we got to Labor John? Do you remember one of the ones that we had in the running?
There was...
It was Cradle of Laborty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think Labor John was quick and to the point. I like
Yeah.
that one.
Okay, so... So mostly they met at 203 Pine Street in South Philly, and that was owned by a fellow named Rittenberg, but he ended up being more interested in using the reading group to marry off his daughters than to actually build class war. So, but they never really expanded beyond just doing these little reading sessions until a fellow named Isidore Prenner came down from New York. He was involved with the Pioneers of Liberty, which was another anarchist group up in New York, and he specifically taught them the ideals of anarchist communism, which was more of a class war focused or class struggle focused anarchism rather than just sitting around and reading and discussing things. So then they started to produce more propaganda. They established a local edition of the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was the Yiddish anarchist newspaper at the time. And that lasted until the 70s, actually.
Oh.
So now the kind of anarchist circles within Philly had really started to focus more on going out and preaching to the masses. And we started to see some results of that.
Oh, okay.
So this should be familiar. So one of the first major left-led strikes among Jewish workers in Philly was the Cloakmakers Strike of 1890. This started with a cloakmakers up in New York City celebrating May Day. So going out on May 1st and declaring it a labor holiday. this was also only 4 years after the Haymarket Affair. So there was still in which there was a strike, then a large protest. There was a bombing at the protest. 8 men were accused of it. 4 men were hanged, despite there being zero evidence of any of them being involved. Also leading to the best defense that ever showed up in court, which is I couldn't be there to throw bombs because I was at home making bombs. Which is just a beautiful alibi.
This trial.
Yep. He still got convicted, but it was still a great alibi. There was both a lot of agitation and a lot of fear of that agitation in the world, in the labor movement at the time. So the cloakmakers up in New York had their May Day labor holiday. The business owners responded to that by starting a lockout, so they didn't let anyone come back into work, which the cloakmakers then responded to by starting a strike. And then they got support from the American Federation of Labor and the United Hebrew Trades, which was a coalition of various Jewish-led unions in New York at the time. And this is also an important point to note that the unions in New York City at the time or the Jewish unions in New York City were generally tied to the socialist and social democratic movements, whereas the unions in Philly were much more tied to the anarchists. Now, the cloakmakers in Philly recognized that they might be used as strike breakers if the companies up in New York started sending business down to Philly. So on May 10th, 1890, 35 cloakmakers that were organized with Cloakmakers Union Local Number 1 of the Jewish Federation of Labor, which was kind of the anarchist version that they made up in Philly of the United Hebrew Trades, because they couldn't be associated with the Social Democratic United Hebrew Trades.
Of course not.
Yeah. But they...
Are you the People's Front of Judea or the People's Front?
Splitter. So they marched out from Bloom Brothers, which you can actually see the sign of on the right-hand side.
Okay.
So that was the storefront for Bloom Brothers, and then on the upper floors, they would have their production facilities. So 35 cloakmakers.
There's a building for rent, guys, if anybody's interested. Yeah. 1890.
Felix Isma something? There's another one for rent over here. So on May 14th, or on May 10th, they marched out. By May 14th, they had 250 cloakmakers out on strike. And then they started to threaten to call a general strike of all cloakmakers in Philly. And then the bosses responded to that by declaring a general lockout of all of the cloakmakers in Philly. So now, basically, they forced everyone, all of the cloakmakers, to go on strike. Yeah. And this is also notable because it was both the skilled workers and the unskilled workers on strike together, because they were listening to those anarcho-communists. I know, it's dangerous. So by August, things had gotten kind of desperate, and the union and the workers were starting to run out of funds. So they held a meeting at the Wheatley Dramatic Hall at 5th and Gaskill. And this is where Max Stoller comes in. At this point, he was just giving speeches. So he gave a bunch of speeches, and H.F. Gordon jumped up on stage and called out, "The police are our enemies. Stand together, and I tell you the truth. When I say that we will wash our hands in the blood of the tyrants."
Oh my God.
Yeah. So that escalated things fairly quickly.
There'll be light refreshments in the back as well.
Yeah.
So.
And the police responded to that by storming the building and chasing everyone out.
They were calling for it.
Yeah. And Max Stoller actually escaped by jumping out of a window onto a fire escape, and then stayed hidden for, I think, 3 days until they found him working at a cigar factory, and then arrested him.
Okay.
Then on August 25th, the Reverend R.W. Christian of the Shiloh Baptist Church was brought in to oversee a workhouse made up of 180 black women to be employed as cloakmakers. And this was, especially in the 1890s, a very common tactic of bringing in black strikebreakers because they knew that they could play on the racial antagonism to make sure that white workers didn't want to unionize with black workers, and most white unions were being extremely exclusive at this point.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's great to play up on race hatred. So the strike ended in August of 1890, shortly after the workhouse was set up. And the only concession that the strikers managed to get was the rehiring of everyone who was out on strike. I wasn't able to find any information on what happened to the 180 black women that were brought in. In all likeliness, they were probably just fired and then left to their own devices. Because that's the other thing that tended to happen is bosses would bring in black workers in order to use them to break a strike, and then the moment the strike was broken, they would kick them back out so that there was no cross-racial solidarity that could build. So,
is this why we drink on the podcast?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure.
Yep. This is also
It's
the
too early
earliest
for
we've
this.
ever recorded. Now, moving on from the 1890s into the 20th century, we're going to talk about the three kind of main streams of thought within the Jewish world at the time. So you had social democrats, like I was talking about. On the left, this is Lewis Miller. On the right, that's Abe Kahn. And both of them were editors for the Yiddish Daily Vorwärts, which was the main Jewish socialist paper coming out of New York at the time, and also out of Philly, I think by like 1904. I don't remember when they were set up in Philly. But they were preaching a specifically, or like sometimes reformist, sometimes revolutionary form of Marxism that it depended a lot on who was writing at the time. But they were the largest paper, and they are still around today. But they remained basically the largest Yiddish newspaper for most of everything we're going to be talking about. Then you have David Edelstadt and Chaim Lieb Weinberg with the Freie Arbeiterstimme, the Yiddish anarchist newspaper. And this not only talked a lot about class politics and economics and everything, but also had a lot of poetry, a lot of music in it, and tended to be the more artsy newspaper, because anarchists. They like to write music. And Freie Arbeiterstimme is the free voice of labor. Then finally we have the more liberal side of the house with Samuel Gompers and Joseph J. Snellenberg.
Good name.
Fantastic name. Snellenberg was a businessman who set up Snellenberg's department store in Philly and was basically a department store magnate. Gompers, like I said, was the founder or one of the founding members of the American Federation of Labor. He started out kind of radical, and then I describe Gompers as a tactical racist. That he got progressively less radical and more racist as he got older, and it was generally tied to just, well, this is expedient for me at the time I'm just going to be more racist now.
All right.
Yeah, so not my favorite person. And so while Gompers probably was only reading the Federationist, which was the American Federation of Labor's newspaper, the more affluent, middle-class, liberal Jewish society in Philly would have been reading the Jewish Exponent, which you can also see just in the advertisements on the front page. Jewelers with diamonds and watches versus just blocks of text about class warfare. There was a very different kind of focus in these newspapers.
That is all ads right there.
Yep. So you can tell the attitudes of all of the newspapers. And the Exponent is still going around, of course. So now we're going to get onto the Girl Army and the Shirtwaist Strike of 1909 to 1910. And again, this strike started up in New York City. This is going to be a running theme because Philly always gets overshadowed, which is annoying. So Clara Lemlech, shirtwaist striker, basically stormed the stage at a convention or at a general meeting of the ILGWU and demanded that they stop just discussing things and declare a strike. And she, after she said that, basically everyone in present unanimously agreed, or almost unanimously. And by the next day, they had tens of thousands of people marching out in the streets. Now, what ended up happening is the shirtwaist makers started to bring more work down to Philadelphia to make up for the loss that they were experiencing up in New York. And the shirtwaist makers in Philly very quickly recognized that that was what was going on. And so by December 20th, decided that they were going to go out and join them on the strike. So between 7,000 and 10,000 shirtwaist makers marched out. And I don't know how well you can see the ages at the bottom there, but most of these were young immigrant girls, aged between, I think the youngest they found was about 10 years old, up into their mid-20s. Most of the
That's
girls...
crazy.
Yeah.
What were you doing at 10 years old, you know?
Not going out on strike in the middle of winter.
Doing very cringeworthy things, but nothing like this. That 14, 12, 12, 12.
Yep. And so they... most of the girls were around like 14 to 18. But they were out on the picket lines, often actually in their best clothes, because they made a point of kind of forcing the juxtaposition of cops coming in and beating up a bunch of very well-dressed teenage girls, because they recognized that if they looked like fresh off the boat immigrants, they would be treated as such. Whereas they were trying to declare themselves as like, no, we are Americans. We
dress nice.
Yeah, we dress nice. And I mean, there were a number of newspaper accounts commenting on the fact of like, you have a 20 or 30 something year old cop beating up this 14-year-old girl in her Sunday or her Shabbos best. And that was not a great image for the Philadelphia Police Department.
Did it work?
Sorry?
But did it work?
But did it work?
They got a fair amount of sympathy from it. And they did actually win a fair amount of support from the kind of middle-class suffrage movement in Philly. There were actually a number of students at Bryn Mawr College that not only joined them on the picket line, but were raising funds for them. And William Howard Taft's daughter was at Bryn Mawr College at the time. She didn't go out on the picket line, but she did raise money for them, for the strikers. And I think 2 of her friends got arrested for marching on the picket line. With the support from like the middle-class suffrage movement, there was still some class antagonism going on there, because a lot of times the wealthier Jewish women would try and bring them in and kind of force them to sit down into negotiations, because they thought that the strike was unwomanly and kind of a little too radical. And after a number of these meetings, one of the women, I don't remember her name, she stood up and said, basically, listen, we'll accept your money and your support, but if you tell us how to run our strike again, we're leaving. And that basically ended that collaboration because the middle-class women did not like being talked back to like that.
Oh, God.
But there were also some kind of crazy antics going on the picket line, from snowballs and rocks being thrown at strikebreakers.
This is Philly.
Yeah, I mean...
There were rocks covered in snowballs
Yeah.
as well.
Someone saw Santa. They had to chuck batteries at him. There was also one young girl, Bessie Hyman, who was 15 years old at the time.
Friend of the show, Bessie. Okay.
Yeah. So she got herself hired at Haber and Company, which was one of the companies that was most opposed to the strike and was continuing to operate during the strike. So she got hired and went in and started to try and organize all of the workers that were breaking the strike. I think she got like 3 days of work in there before she got found out, and then she was literally dragged out of the factory because she was fighting the police trying to drag her out. But she was fighting till the end, and she was also the president of her marker and cleaners union.
At 15 years old.
At 15 years old.
Jeez.
So then on January 19th, a fire broke out at one of the shirtwaist shops on Dock Street, which was basically just a converted warehouse without any like fire escapes or any way to get out of the building safely. There were, among the dead were two of the two daughters of the building's owner, as well as two women who had left the picket line because basically they were starving at that point. The two women who left the picket line were Ida Greenberg and Rebecca Kaufman. And at that point, Abraham Rosenberg, the president of the ILGWU, came down and gave a speech announcing the tragedy to an overflowing meeting of all of the shirtwaist makers, because they recognized that everyone that died in that factory and everyone who was injured there was one of their sisters. They did finally win a fair amount of concessions. They didn't get full union recognition, but they did get shorter hours, better pay, and a reduction in the number of penalties and costs. It was one of the things that tended to happen at this time was you would get charged if you broke a needle. Sometimes you would get charged for the thread that you were using to sew garments for your boss. And there were a lot of little things like that where even though all of this was technically being provided by your employer, you were getting charged for any consumables. So, and they actually ended up winning more concessions than the women up in New York, mostly because they were able to hold out a little bit more thoroughly than the women up in New York. But both of these kind of reinvigorated the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which then became one of the largest Jewish unions in the country, both in Philly and New York. And there was also another sympathy strike in Baltimore, I believe. But now we're going to move on to some of the kind of community institutions that existed, because it wasn't just all strikes. And
It's not all fun.
No. So the two of the really important parts of the left Jewish community in Philly at the time were the labor lyceums and the Arbeter Ring. So the labor lyceums were started as kind of an offshoot of the German idea of Landmannschaften, which were like fraternal immigrant societies.
Okay.
So there's this big bearded German guy who's a big German socialist, who I think he self-described as a dangerous labor agitator, if I remember correctly. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Fritzsche, and at a May Day picnic in 1889, he proposed creating a labor lyceum. A lyceum is basically like a speaking hall. Then you have the Arbeter Ring, the Workers' Circle or Workmen's Circle, now Workers' Circle. That was originally established up in New York in 1890 as more of a fraternal organization. And then by 1904, the Gershuni branch was established in Philly. It's unclear how many other branches there were in Philly or when it officially started here, but we know that by 1904, the Gershuni branch was here. By World War I, there were at least 10 branches, each with a minimum of 25 members. And they were named either for shtetls or villages back in the old country. So you had like the Bialystok, the Bialystok branch, the Rovner branch. Then they were also named for famous Jewish socialists and Bundists, Vladimir Medem, Arkady Kremer, Morris Sigman, and others. And each branch operated independently, basically, but they were a like mutual aid organization, a cultural organization. They'd hold parties, festivals, and then also help each other out whenever anyone was in need. And they also served as organizing locations and did a lot of strike support. And I should also note, while all of this was going on, there were still anarchist groups in Philly doing similar mutual aid work. Like the Mount Sinai Hospital was basically being run as a free clinic for Jewish workers. And I think there were 3 separate anarchist hospitals in Philly operating by the early 1900s. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the fun riots that happened. The 1917 Kosher food riots. Kosher food riots have been a consistent theme among the early 20th century Jewish life. But the ones in Philly in 1917 started in part because the workers at the sugar refineries in South Philly were out on strike. And it initially started as the refinery workers themselves going out on strike, and then the Wobblies came in and organized them on the picket line.
That's the IWW.
Yes.
Industrial Workers of the World.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. And it was also, sugar workers were Lithuanians, Poles, Ashkenazi Jews. I think there were some Irish workers as well, but it was a very diverse group. Basically, everyone living in South Philly either worked at sugar refineries or on the docks. But while that strike was going on, there was also really high inflation and food prices were skyrocketing. And Jewish women in New York had organized a food strike, which was basically a boycott of all of the vendors up in New York. And so partially inspired by that, and then also partially inspired by the militant labor actions of the IWW, on February 21st, 200 women met at the Lithuanian Hall at Moyamensing and Christian, which still exists today. It is now condos.
Of course it is.
Yep. As everything will eventually turn into. And then another 100 met at the synagogue at 4th and Wharton. And so the women up in New York City had marched on City Hall. And everyone kind of assumed that that's where this was going to go. But instead, the women stayed at Lithuanian Hall, and the 32-year-old Florence Schadle of 110 Wharton Street insisted that the strike was driving the families of the locked-out men to the verge of starvation, and urged the women to adopt militant methods to drive out the strikebreakers. Around 5 p.m., they marched out of Lithuanian Hall, met up with their comrades at 4th and Wharton, and then marched towards the American Sugar Refinery, which was over on the waterfront. As they passed Engine 46, which was the fire department house, at Reed and Water Street, they shouted insults at the cops that were there, and there were accounts of them throwing red pepper at them. This is the only time...
At the cops?
At the cops. I don't know if this was just makeshift pepper spray. But the newspapers
They're
reported...
like, just tell me when.
Yeah, like, well, they also said they had pepper grinders with them, which...
They're good weapons.
Yeah. And, like, yeah, a big old wooden and steel pepper grinder would hurt. And it was... Yeah, that was just one of the stranger things that I've run into.
Are we going to get to the sugar snipers?
Yes. We will, actually.
Everybody else is like, what are you talking about?
So the crowd grew to around 2,000 people, and they stood facing 250 Philadelphia police, along with some security from the sugar refinery, which included snipers mounted up on the roof and the walls of the sugar refineries. The women and the crowd there started singing labor songs, and were also just crying out that their children were starving. It should also be noted that a lot of these women literally were carrying their kids on their hips while going through all of this. The tension mounted, and police started to take cover behind their trucks. It's unclear who opened fire first, but at some point a gunshot rang out. The Inquirer said that it was strikers, but yeah, I'm not sure I trust that. That being said...
Like 5 minutes ago, all he had was pepper.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
Like, so once that first shot rang out, the crowd started throwing bricks at the cops. Or basically anything that they could find laying around. They just started throwing them at the police trucks. And then the police responded by opening fire with their pistols. And then charged into the crowd with their clubs. Then company snipers on nearby rooftops started just firing pot shots into the crowd.
Nice.
Yeah. And after basically, I think about 2 hours-ish of just melee, I don't think they were firing into the crowd for a full 2 hours, but the cops waded in with their clubs and basically just beat the crowd back for 2 hours until they dissipated. Then, after the crowd cleared, there was only one body that was found. A worker was recently joined the IWW by the name of Markionis Petkos. It was a striking sugar worker, and a massive funeral was held for him the next Tuesday, made up of both Jews and Gentiles. It was basically the whole of the Philly labor movement marched out for this guy.
That's surprising. Only one person was killed.
Yeah. There were actually a lot of the wounded people were taken to Mount Sinai Hospital because it was a free anarchist clinic that would, one of the few places that would treat strikers. But the food problems were not yet over. Women up in Kensington were also facing similar issues, and organized by Mrs. Hugh F. Monroe, who was kind of a leading Philadelphia philanthropist, wrote a letter to the mayor begging for some assistance for the poor women. The women in South Philly took a slightly different approach. The same night that Miss Monroe sent that letter in, the women in South Philly stormed food vendors at 7th and Moore Street, yelling that their prices were robbery. They were specifically upset by the cost of fish and onions, because those are the key ingredients for gefilte fish.
Ah, okay.
Which was the...
I gotta try gefilte fish. Never tried gefilte fish.
Fresh-made gefilte fish is good.
Yeah.
Out of a jar, it's interesting. So they attacked butcher shops as well, doused one shop in kerosene and threatened to light it on fire.
Damn.
They didn't light it on fire, but I'm sure that he was a little terrified. Then they met at the synagogue at 6th and Siegel Street, gave more speeches, and eventually, after basically 2 or 3 days of constant agitation and rioting, a state probe was created to look into the rising food costs. Nothing was ever really done about it, though. until the U.S. entered World War One, at which point there was a slight economic uptick, and the federal government came in and started doing some price controls for the war effort. But yeah, there was never really a resolution there.
No. Jeez.
Yeah. But a committee was established to think about looking into possibly how to solve the problem. And that's progress.
Tax dollars at work.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk about the rise of Jewish communists.
Hey, this is the fun stuff.
Yeah. So in 1917, Russian Revolution happened. Tsar was overthrown, and then Lenin and the Bolshevik Party overthrew the provisional government, and that led to the Russian Civil War and kind of a smaller verbal civil war among the left in the U.S. as to whether or not to support the new Soviet government, or to adopt their tactics, or to continue with a more reformist, or either reformist, sometimes Orthodox Marxist, just anything other than Vanguard Party approach. That led to the Communist Party, or the creation of the Communist Party of the United States in 1919, which initially operated a Yiddish section in the U.S. By 1922, the communist-aligned Yiddish newspaper, the Morgen Freiheit, was being published, and that also, that fairly quickly grew in popularity as well, with the more radical side of the Jewish left. So now you had 4 newspapers all circulating throughout the Jewish community, or 4 major ones. There were like dozens, if not hundreds, because basically like every neighborhood had its own little Yiddish newspaper that all complained about everyone else. And there were also other communist-aligned newspapers that didn't like that. Yeah, no one can get along or agree on anything. This also triggered a split in the Arbeter Ring, which was deeply connected to the Socialist Party. So when the Socialist Party and the Communist Party split, there were constant fights within the Arbeter Ring as to whether or not they would side with the new Communist Party or stay with the Socialist. They set up 2 separate summer camps. You had, I don't remember the name of the 2 different ones, but there was...
You don't need to know everything, Gabe.
I know.
It's okay.
There was a communist children's summer camp.
He does need to know everything.
And a socialist children's summer camp, and they, again, did not get along with each other. And then in 1930, the Communist Party created the International Workers' Order, or I should say communists created the International Workers' Order, because the other fun part of how the Communist Party operated, and still kind of does today, is nothing is ever officially aligned to the party. So it's just party members setting these things up, separated from the party as sort of a semi-front organization, but not really. And but yeah, basically. So the International Workers Order, which was a mutual aid organization that and also insurance company or insurance society that was open to anyone regardless of sex, nationality, race, color, creed, or political affiliation. So the IWO actually grew very quickly in the 30s because it was, before Social Security, it was one of the only truly free and open mutual aid insurance sources. They also then created on the 13th floor of 1315 Walnut, which still exists.
Okay.
It's still an office building. But they established the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, which was to replace the cultural programming of the Arbeter Ring within members of the International Working Men's or International Workers Order. And so they started doing secular Yiddish cultural events, putting out songbooks, shows, musicals, stuff like that, and festivals. It was also specifically built to organize both the left and the Jewish left to combat anti-Semitism and fascism, because that was increasingly becoming a focus in the early 1930s, surprisingly. So now we're going to get into the Jewish left in the New Deal era. Because in 1929, the stock market crashed, which made a lot of people very poor. And there were, again, multiple responses to this. The more radical left was basically taking this as an opportunity to organize for revolution. The more reformist left was trying to draft policy just to keep people alive. And eventually, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes into power, or becomes president, and brings out the New Deal. And more importantly for us, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 opened the gates to semi-legal union organizing. At this point, there was barely any federal labor law actually supporting unionization. The National Industrial Recovery Act basically said the federal government supports the right of people to organize unions. Yeah. And that was it.
About time.
Yeah. There was no instructions on how to do that. There was no instructions on what that looked like in practice. There was none, there wasn't really the National Labor Relations Board like we have today. But that set off a huge spur of unionizing. Then in 1935, you have the National Labor Relations Act. That established the National Labor Relations Board, which was supposed to be a consistent mediator between workers and bosses. By the end of the 30s, you had some amount of pro-worker legislation in the U.S. And initially, all of this had been one of the main focuses of this had actually been to calm the labor movement down, because it was incredibly militant and fairly violent, or the bosses' responses were fairly violent in the 30s, and they were trying to basically do anything they could to avoid just a total revolution, because there was a lot of discussion of that. And we should also note that both the National Industrial Recovery Act and the National Labor Relations Act left out farm, domestic, municipal, and other workers, mostly to preserve some level of racial difference within the workforce in the U.S. So domestic labor was predominantly black at this point. Farm labor was, and still is, predominantly immigrants, and that's farm labor was also not. It wasn't just immigrants coming up from South America. It was also a lot of fresh immigrants coming over from Italy and Southern Europe, and then there was also a lot of black farm labor in the South. And all of them were excluded from having any legal protection for organizing.
Nice.
Which is great.
It's great.
Yeah. Then within the Jewish left, you had the Jewish Labor Committee established in 1934. This was initially created to not only combat anti-Semitism and rising fascism, but also provide support within the Jewish labor movement. And they did a lot of organizing for mutual aid. They helped get labor leaders out of Europe as Hitler was coming to power, and as Germany was starting to rearm and become more increasingly explicitly anti-Semitic. They also, immediately after the Holocaust, were petitioning to get 400,000 visas to bring survivors back over, just as a way to get them out of the displaced person camps. They also worked collaboratively with a lot of the labor left, even the non-Jewish labor left in Europe. And them and the Jewish Labor Bund in Poland worked a lot with the socialist parties across Europe to try and organize some kind of collective anti-fascism that didn't really work out for a variety of reasons, mostly because everyone was too busy fighting each other and communists to fight the Nazis. And so it didn't work out that well. But they were trying. And then finally we have the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a challenger to the American Federation of Labor, which at this point had become fairly conservative, at least at the upper levels. Individual locals were varied from either very conservative and racist to basically entirely communist. And the AFL, it's very hard to gauge in the 30s, but their overall leadership tended to be very conservative. The CIO was was focused on industrial organizing, and they wanted to organize all workers across all fields as basically one entire class. And within the CIO, you had a lot of various left-led or left-aligned unions as well. So now we're going to get on to the silky smooth stocking strikers.
Jeez, if you don't listen to the show, all this is just going over your head. It's like, these guys, what is wrong with them?
The American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers launched a movement in April 29th, 1937, to organize Apex Hosiery up in Kensington, which was one of the last hosiery mills in Philly that wasn't organized at this point. And these were making mostly women's stockings, which were not only an incredibly common item because they were worn basically every day, but also tended to tear and rip, so they were being replaced constantly. So there was a lot of built-in obsolescence, which meant that they were constantly being produced. So they started to demonstrate out front of the gates of Apex, but the police had set up between them and the mill itself, so they couldn't actually get into the building. That is until a demonstration of between 5,000 and 10,000 strikers, because there were only about, I think, 1,500 to 2,000 people that worked in the factory, but basically the whole of the labor left in Philly came out in support of organizing Apex.
Good.
And this is really the power of the CIO at this point. So between 5,000 and 10,000 people showed up at this demonstration, overwhelmed the police, and just stormed into the gates and occupied the plant. So by noon, they had basically come in and taken over and evicted both the plant manager, Harry Strube, and Mr. Meyer, who was the owner. And one of the workers actually described it as storming the Bastille to go and start the revolution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So 250 strikers set up in the mill and said that they were going to occupy it for as long as they needed. There was a whole mutual aid network set up to get food, water, clothing to them. And basically the entire mill was surrounded by a throng of people for days. And that's the Apex Mill on the right there. And this is what it looked like out front of the mill, at least on the first day of the occupation.
Wow.
There were also a lot of people complaining that streetcar service was interrupted.
Yeah, they're not going anywhere.
By those massive people. It's always interesting reading the Inquirer accounts, because they'll talk about this mass of 10,000 people and then be like, and the worst part is that the streetcar service was interrupted. Then
I blame SEPTA.
Yeah.
This is pre-SEPTA, though, right?
Yeah, but it's still SEPTA's fault.
Yeah, it's still SEPTA.
So they occupied the plant for a solid month, and there was an attempted eviction order and multiple lawsuits from the Apex Hosiery Company. Eventually, the President William Leader, the union president, agreed to have the workers vacate the premises. This was in part because he had supported Mayor Wilson's campaign when he was running for mayor. This also meant that they kind of had the cops in their back pockets, and that the police at this point weren't Other sit-down strikes, like in Flint, Michigan, led to the police and National Guard coming out with machine guns. That didn't happen here, mostly because Mayor Wilson knew that this was his voter base, and he wasn't going to piss them off. So there's some use to electoralism. Or there's use to having a massively organized group of working class people who can threaten electeds. So they both William Leader and Mayor Wilson walked into the plant under a flag of truce, and then walked out with the 250 strikers who had been occupying it, and they marched past a crowd of 15,000 people, all cheering them on in basically what turned into a big parade.
Yeah.
This was mostly a way of showing good faith for negotiations, because the strike wasn't over. They maintained a solid picket line of 3,000 people out front of the plant for, I believe, another 2 months as negotiations continued. And so this was both various other people from the CIO would come out and join the picket line. There were strikers from Apex Mills themselves out on the line. It was really, again, the Philly working class in the 30s or by the late 30s, had really come together as like a single entity that could be aimed at anyone they wanted it to.
Nice.
Yeah. Now, the women who were on strike were, again, mostly the daughters of Jewish immigrants. And they had a kind of distinct take on what they described as like labor femininity. Similar to the stocking strikers back in 1910, they made a point of like showing that they were keeping their sense of femininity out on the picket line. So they would show up in very nice dresses. They would always have their hair done. And they were also doing things like holding dances, having big, like, basically parties out front of the mill. And that's both a way to keep your spirits up while out on strike. And also they used it as fundraising for the strike fund and everything like that. So by 1938, because the strike ended, I believe, in the summer of 37, but negotiations continued. And by by 1938, they had gotten a closed shop contract, at which point just about 100% of stocking production in Philly was organized with AFWA, and they basically could get any contract concession they wanted because they could shut down the entire city.
There you go.
Pretty quickly.
It's almost like this stuff works.
Yeah,
you know?
It's surprising. I keep finding that, and I don't know why. And this was one of the kind of biggest successes of the Jewish labor left in Philly, that they were able to get the majority of the textile industry in Philly and the entirety of the stocking industry organized. And that had started really all the way going back to the Cloakmakers in 1890, but by the end of the 30s, they had really solidified it.
Yeah.
And now the not fun slide. During wartime, most of the CIO and the American Federation of Labor had agreed to a no-strike pledge, and had set up a basically established labor peace for the war. However, that was broken in 1944 when about 4,000 very racist trolley drivers for the Philadelphia Transit Company had a sick-out strike in protest of 8 black workers being promoted to trolley drivers. This was also part of an internal union battle between the CIO-aligned Transit Workers Union and the AFL-aligned, it's a really long name, it's like electric streetcar railroad stuff people. In response to that strike, the NAACP in Philly launched a massive protest campaign and basically and made appeals to the federal government. And the U.S. Army actually came in and broke the strike, occupying the city for like 2 weeks. And because there were also fairly legitimate fears of race riots breaking out, started by the racist trolley workers. The NAACP was just doing picket lines and protest marches. And a lot of the Jewish labor left was supporting the NAACP and the Communist Party as well in their fight against the strikers. Because as we talked about in the Mike Quinn. Quill. Yeah. Episode, the Transit Workers Union was basically entirely communist. So the Jewish Labor Committee, moving on from the Philly Transit Company strike, Jewish Labor Committee continued to hold functions to raise money to send to victims of the Holocaust. They were also working to get Jewish labor bundists and other Jewish labor organizers out of Europe. Morgan Freiheit and other Yiddish communist publications were closely following the Red Army as it was fighting in Eastern Europe. After the war, though, both Jewish service members that had gone overseas and survivors of the Holocaust who had made it to the United States came back to a very changed society. There was both economic depression immediately after war and a massive strike wave, which then led to a massive conservative backlash in the 1946 congressional elections or midterm elections, which led to the Taft-Hartley slave labor bill. This basically forced all of the Communist Party members out of American Union leadership and took away a lot of the tactics that unions were able to use in the 30s, like sympathy strikes, boycotts, wildcat strikes, and made a lot of very radical tactics illegal. And this was one of the first major pieces of oppression of the left that started McCarthyism.
Yeah.
And some scholars like Benjamin Balthazar have called the HUAC and the Red Scare of the 40s and 50s the largest anti-Semitic campaign that the federal government has ever engaged in, because it really specifically targeted the radical Jewish left. To, I think it was 20% of people targeted by HUAC were Jewish.
Wow.
At a point where we were, I think, less than 2% of the U.S. population. So a little skewed there.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. But there were a lot of people a lot of organizations that managed to survive it, mostly by being less openly radical. So both the Jewish Labor Committee and the Arbeter Ring survived. The Arbeter Ring was in Philly until the 90s, from what I can tell. They also, one of the things they had set up was Folkshuls all around Philly.
Okay.
And clearly they still exist,
Yes.
or at least one does. Yeah. Jewish Labor Committee.
And we're happy to have you, brother.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Jewish Labor Committee still exists. So there's still some embers burning after HUAC.
Yeah.
But there's the kind of radical Jewish left has been always tied to the broader American Jewish left. It has never existed independently of that. So really this is more symptomatic of repression going on since 1947.
Yeah.
But there's still some hope for the future. So shall we play some music?
I guess we should.
Yeah.
It's a Yiddish song, but I have enough respect for the language that I'm not going to do any of it in Yiddish. It's going to be English, except for the title of the song. It's called Arbeiter Froyen.
Yeah.
Arbeiter Froyen. It's called, is that Hardworking Women? Is that
Working Women, yeah.
Okay. working women, women who labor in factories and homes, joining the fight for it's only the beginning. No one should stand in the struggle alone. Let us all carry the red flag together, weathering storms in the dark of the night, building the temple of freedom together, helping each other to carry the light. So many sisters, daughters, and mothers have given their lives to the things they believe. Mighty as lions, they fight for each other, freedom, justice, and equality. Carry the banner as sisters and brothers, waking the world to the light of the day, as friends and companions, as comrades and lovers. Arbeter Froyen, show us the way. There you go, that's it for you. And so, Gabe,
Thank you.
thank you, sir,
Thank you. And thank you
for
everyone.
carrying all the weight tonight.
I'm surprised I got through all of it.